A dying woman pressed a baby into a stranger's arms and whispered 5 words. I made her a promise. Now Lillian Moore is alone in the Montana wilderness, carrying a child that isn't hers, a secret that powerful men will kill to bury, and a name that isn't real. The men who murdered everyone on that stagecoach are coming back, and the only person standing between her and them is a broken cowboy hauling cattle, a man running from something he did 18 years ago that he still can't say out loud. Welcome to Wild West Stories, where the dust of the frontier carries the weight of the human soul. This channel is your place for tales of cowboys and outlaws, love that blooms in the harshest ground, the unbreakable bond between a mother and the child she chooses, and the quiet compassion between strangers who have every reason to walk away, but don't. This story reminds us that the bravest thing you can do isn't pulling a trigger. It's staying when every instinct tells you to run, and that sometimes the people who've lost the most are the only ones willing to sacrifice everything for someone else's child. If Lillian and Ethan's journey moved something inside you, hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? I love watching these stories cross oceans. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience.
Ethan had been pushing 14 head of cattle across the Montana plains since before dawn. 14 cows that did not belong to him, one aging horse named Judge, and 6 days of hard trail between him and the Buford Ranch where a $40 payday waited. $40. That was 6 months of sweat and saddle sores and sleeping on ground so hard it bruised his hip bones. But $40 meant 8 more toward the 40 acres near Judith Basin he had been saving for since the war ended. That land was the only promise he had ever made to himself that still held any weight at all. He was 38 years old, and he looked every year of it. Lean the way men get when meals come irregular, with sun-darkened skin and hands that had more callus than smooth flesh left on them. The burn scar running from his left wrist to his elbow had faded some over the years, but never enough to forget where it came from. A supply depot at Shiloh. A match struck in darkness, and sounds afterward that he heard every single night when the whiskey wore off and the dreams came crawling back. But Ethan did not think about Shiloh. He never thought about Shiloh. That was the rule he lived by, and most days it worked well enough to keep him upright and moving forward. The vultures appeared first. Not the graceful circles you see in paintings, but ugly competitive shapes fighting over position, their wings making a wet, heavy flapping sound that carried across the still air. A dozen of them at least, wheeling and diving at something beyond the next rise. Then came the smell. Ethan had learned the difference between horse death and human death on the battlefields of Tennessee, where both lay together in the mud and the summer heat made everything worse. He knew that difference the way a man knows his own name, and right now the wind was carrying both. He touched his heels to Judge's flanks, and the old horse responded with a reluctant increase in pace. They crested the low rise, and the scene below stopped Ethan's breath dead in his chest. A stagecoach lay on its side like a shot animal, one wheel still turning slow in the wind. But this was not a simple wreck. The luggage had been pulled from the boot and scattered across the ground in a pattern that spoke of method, not chaos. Trunks opened, contents sorted through, then discarded. Someone had been searching for something specific, and from the look of things, they had not found it. 3 bodies. The driver lay crumpled near the overturned coach with his neck bent at an angle that did not need a doctor to explain. A male passenger had made it several yards from the wreckage before falling face down in the dirt, and Ethan could see even from this distance the dark stain on the back of his coat that meant a bullet had gone through his chest and out the other side. That changed everything. A crash was an accident. A bullet was a decision. The third body was a woman, middle-aged, wearing quality clothing that spoke of comfortable means. She lay 10 feet from the coach with one arm stretched toward a clump of scrub willow at the edge of the trail, reaching for something even in death. And there in the willows, that was where Ethan saw her. A young woman sitting on the bare ground with her back against a dead cottonwood trunk, holding a baby against her chest. Her face was covered in blood that clearly was not her own. Her traveling dress, some shade of dove gray that might once have been handsome, was ruined with dust and dark stains. Her hair had come loose and hung around her shoulders in tangled waves. But it was her eyes that held Ethan where he stood. They were open. They were aimed in his direction. But they were seeing nothing at all. It was the 1,000-yard stare he recognized from men who had been under artillery fire too long. The look of someone whose mind had gone somewhere far away to survive what the body could not escape. The baby in her arms was silent. Eyes open, body still, and for one terrible moment Ethan thought the child was dead. He swung down from Judge and approached slow, keeping his hands visible, moving the way you move toward a wounded animal that might bolt or bite. When he got close enough, he reached out and touched the baby's forehead. Warm. The child was alive. But it had screamed itself past exhaustion sometime in the night, and had nothing left to give. Ethan crouched down in front of the woman. Up close, he could see she was young, mid-20s at most, with fine bones and a mouth set in a hard line even in her fugue state. Her hands were locked around the baby with a grip so tight the tendons stood out like wire. She had not loosened that hold in hours, maybe longer. He checked the dead woman. She had been gone at least 5 or 6 hours, probably more. The stiffness was already setting in and the flies had found her. Which meant this young woman had been sitting here all night long in the dark, surrounded by the dead, holding a baby that was not her own. He went back to her, pulled the canteen from his belt and held it to her lips. Water ran down her chin, but some of it got in, and after a moment her eyes shifted, focused, came back from wherever they had gone. She looked at Ethan, then she looked at the baby. Then she looked at the dead woman lying in the dust with her arm still reaching toward the willows. Ethan kept his voice low, steady, the way you talk to someone standing on the edge of a cliff. "Ma'am, is the baby yours?" She shook her head. A small movement, barely there. When she spoke, her voice came out cracked and dry, like paper left too long in the sun. But the words were clear. 5 words that Ethan Cole would remember for the rest of his natural life. I made her a promise. Ethan sat back on his heels and looked at the scene again. The ransacked luggage. The bullet hole in the dead man's chest. The systematic way everything had been searched and discarded. This was not robbery. Road agents would have taken the valuables and left. This was something else entirely. This was murder. Planned, deliberate, and aimed at finding something that the killers had not recovered from the wreckage, which meant that whatever they were looking for was still out here somewhere, on the surviving woman, or on the baby, or buried in the scattered remains of the luggage. And it meant they would be coming back. Lillian knew she should tell the stranger everything. But the truth was the thing that had destroyed her life in Philadelphia, and she was not sure she could survive it destroying another one. The man who had found her said his name was Ethan Cole. He said he was a drover pushing cattle to the Buford Ranch. He said he was going to help her get to somewhere safe. He said all of this in a voice that carried the flat certainty of someone accustomed to making decisions in bad situations, and Lillian supposed she should have felt grateful. Instead, she felt the same cold calculation that had kept her alive for the past 6 months click into place behind her eyes. What did this man want? What did he know? What would he do if he found out the truth? Because the truth was a complicated and dangerous thing. Her name was not Clara Bennett, though that was what her papers said. Her name was Lillian Moore, and she was 26 years old, and she had been a school teacher in Philadelphia until 4 months ago, when the man she was engaged to marry had turned out to be something unspeakable. William Ashford. William Ashford. Professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania. Heir to a family whose money came from coal and steel. and secretly the architect of a system that funneled orphan children from city workhouses into coal mines where they worked until they broke or died. Lillian had discovered it by accident, a ledger left open on his desk, columns of numbers that did not add up until she realized the numbers were children. She had reported him. No one believed her. Ashford had money and connections, and the kind of respectable reputation that made people choose comfortable lies over ugly truths. He buried the accusation, destroyed her teaching career, and made it clear through intermediaries that if she continued to make noise, the consequences would extend beyond professional ruin. So Lillian ran. Not for a fresh start, not for adventure. She ran because staying meant either silence or destruction, and she could not stomach either one. She had boarded the stage in Helena 3 days ago under the name Clara Bennett, heading south with no clear destination except away. And it was on that stage that she had met Helen Garrett. Helen was the middle-aged woman now lying dead in the Montana dust. She had been traveling with her infant daughter Sarah, heading to Fort Benton to join her husband, Captain James Garrett. But Helen was more than a captain's wife. During the long hours of the stage ride, as the two women sat across from each other reading the fear in each other's faces, the way women learn to read danger in a world that gives them plenty of practice, they had shared their secrets. Helen Garrett had been a Union intelligence operative during the Civil War, and she had never entirely stopped that work. She was carrying evidence of corruption at Fort Benton. A small leather-bound ledger hidden in the lining of her baby's cloth diapers containing records of weapons smuggling, bribery, and murder orchestrated by the fort's commanding officer, Colonel Silas Whitmore. And Lillian had told Helen about Ashford, about the children, about the running. Two women with dangerous knowledge sitting in a stagecoach that neither of them knew was already marked for death. When the riders came, 4 of them with bandanas pulled up over their faces, everything happened fast. The driver tried to outrun them. A wheel caught. The coach rolled. And in the wreckage, with the driver dead and the male passenger shot, and Helen Garrett bleeding from wounds that would not stop, the dying woman had pulled Lillian close and whispered words that went beyond a simple plea to protect her child. The ledger is in the diaper lining. Take it to Judge Mercer in Virginia City. Do not trust anyone in uniform. And then the 5 words that bound them together across the line between living and dead. Promise me you will keep her safe. I promise, Lillian had said. And Helen Garrett had closed her eyes and let go. Now Lillian sat on a horse she did not own, following a man she did not trust, carrying a baby that was not hers, and a secret that could get them all killed. The August sun hammered down without mercy, and the Montana plains stretched in every direction like an ocean of brown grass and shimmering heat. She had torn her shawl in half and bound baby Sarah to her chest, but the knots kept slipping, and the baby's head kept lolling to one side in a way that made Lillian's stomach clench with fear. She did not know how to care for an infant. She had taught girls aged 10 to 16 at a Philadelphia academy. She knew Shakespeare and arithmetic and the proper way to conjugate Latin verbs. She did not know how to keep a 6-month-old alive in the wilderness. The condensed milk in the feeding bottle was going sour in the heat. She could smell it turning. And Sarah, who had been eerily quiet since Ethan found them, was starting to feel warm in a way that had nothing to do with the sun. Ethan noticed before she did. He pulled alongside and reached over without asking, pressing the back of his hand to the baby's forehead. His hands were rough and scarred, but his touch was careful in a way that did not match the rest of him. "She is running a fever," he said. "Could be the heat, could be something worse. We need to cool her down, wet a cloth and lay it across her forehead. Keep her in the shade as much as you can." "I know what to do," Lillian snapped, though she absolutely did not. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly and without judgment, "You are letting your pride put that child in danger. She needs help. Take it or do not. But do not pretend you have this handled when you clearly do not." The words hit like a slap because they were true. Lillian took the damp cloth he offered and pressed it to Sarah's forehead and said nothing for a long time afterward. They rode in silence through the worst of the afternoon heat. At one point, Ethan asked her name, and Lillian heard herself say, Clara Bennett, the lie coming out smooth and automatic, the way lies do when you have been telling them long enough. But later, when they stopped to water the horses at a shallow creek, Ethan went through the luggage he had salvaged from the wreck. He was looking for supplies, anything useful, and Lillian watched him open a carpet bag that must have been hers, because inside, among the clothes and teaching credentials, he found a book. He held it up and read the inscription on the inside cover. Then he looked at her. He did not say anything. He just tucked the book back into the bag and went on sorting through the supplies. But the way he looked at her after that was different, measuring, weighing. The eyes of a man who had just learned that the woman he was risking his neck for had given him a false name and was deciding how much that mattered. That night they made camp in a shallow draw near a creek bed, with scrub willow and cottonwood providing some cover. Lillian fed Sarah the last of the milk that had not gone completely sour, and the baby took it reluctantly, making faces that under other circumstances might have been funny. After Sarah finally slept, Lillian lay on the hard ground and pretended to do the same. She was still pretending when she heard the horses, not one, 3 or 4 coming from the north, from the direction of the wrecked stagecoach. Ethan had heard them first. When Lillian opened her eyes, the campfire was dead and cold, stamped out so recently that smoke still hung in the air. And Ethan was lying prone behind a boulder with his rifle trained on the darkness beyond the creek. "Do not move," he whispered. "Do not let her cry." Lillian pressed Sarah against her chest and held the baby so tight she was afraid of hurting her. She could hear the horses now, the creak of saddle leather, the low murmur of men's voices, and cutting through all of it, one voice that stood out from the rest, hoarse and distinctive, like gravel being dragged across tin. A voice giving orders in short, clipped sentences. The riders passed somewhere in the darkness, close enough that Lillian could smell the horses. And then they were gone. The hoofbeats faded south and east, until there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the creek, and Lillian's own heartbeat pounding so loud, she was amazed it had not given them away. Neither of them moved for 2 more hours. When Ethan finally came back to where she lay, his face in the starlight was harder than she had ever seen it. "They are hunting," he said. "Not searching. Hunting. Whoever they are, they know what they are looking for, and they know they did not find it." He looked at her in a way that said he knew she was hiding something. She looked back in a way that said she was not ready to tell him what. And in the space between those 2 silences, baby Sarah slept on, unaware of any of it. 4 riders had passed within 200 yards of where they lay in the dark. Ethan had counted each set of hoofbeats and prayed for the first time since Shiloh. He was not sure the prayer counted since it consisted mainly of the words, "Please God, not now." But it was the best he could manage under the circumstances. They reached Jensen's way station at dawn. The building squatted low against the landscape, rough timber and sod with a barn and corral behind it. Smoke rising from the chimney in a thin line that meant someone was already up and stoking the fire. Ethan had been here before, 3 or 4 times over the years pushing cattle through the territory, and he knew the Jensens as the kind of frontier people who asked few questions and offered genuine help without making you feel like charity. Martha Jensen opened the door before they reached the porch, a solid, weathered woman with a face that had seen 30 hard years on the Montana plain, and had not let them make her mean. She took one look at Ethan, then at Lillian, then at the baby in Lillian's arms. And her face went white. It was only for a moment. A flash of something, recognition or fear or both, that crossed her features and then disappeared behind the mask of frontier hospitality. But Ethan saw it. He filed it away in the part of his mind that cataloged things that did not add up, the same part that had noticed the systematic way the luggage had been ransacked, and the bullet hole in the dead man's chest, and the way Lillian handled the baby like someone trained in an institution rather than a home. "Come inside," Martha said, her voice steady again. "Both of you look ready to fall over. I will get coffee started, and we can figure out what needs figuring." The interior of the way station was simple but clean. A large common room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and the smell of coffee and biscuits that hit Ethan's empty stomach like a physical blow. He had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days, and his body was reminding him of that fact with increasing urgency. Martha's husband, Henry, emerged from the back, a tall, quiet man with a shotgun held casually across his chest. He nodded at Ethan, studied Lillian and the baby, then looked at his wife. Some kind of silent communication passed between them, the kind that comes from decades of marriage and shared hardship, and Henry went to check the corral without saying a word. Ethan settled Lillian in a chair near the fire and then pulled Martha aside. He gave her the full account in low tones. The wrecked stage, the 3 dead, the ransacked luggage and the bullet wound that turned an accident into a murder, the 4 riders in the night, and the woman who called herself Clara Bennett but owned a book inscribed to Lillian Moore of Philadelphia. Martha listened without interruption. When he finished, she said, "And the baby?" "The dying woman's. Mrs. Garrett was her name, or that is what the woman says. She claims Mrs. Garrett made her promise to keep the child safe." Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You need rest, both of you. I will watch the baby. Take a few hours." Ethan wanted to argue, but his body would not let him. He found a corner, laid his rifle within arm's reach, and was asleep before his head fully settled against the wall. He slept for 4 hours, which was more rest than he had gotten in the past 3 days combined. When he woke, the sun was high and the station was quiet. He found Martha on the porch with the baby, rocking in a chair and humming something tuneless while Sarah slept against her shoulder. "Where is she?" Ethan asked. "Sleeping in the back room. I gave her clean clothes and food, and she was out like a snuffed candle." Ethan nodded and sat down on the porch rail. The question he had been carrying since the crash site would not wait any longer. "She is lying to me, Martha. Her name is not Clara Bennett. She is hiding something about what happened on that stage. And whatever she is hiding has people on horseback searching the territory for her in the middle of the night. I need to know if I am walking into something that is going to get me killed." Martha rocked the chair slowly. "Could be she has her reasons for lying. Women on the frontier usually do. Everybody has reasons. What I need to know is whether hers are going to put a bullet in my chest." Martha did not answer that directly. Instead, she said, "What are you going to do with her?" "Get her to the next town. She can figure the rest out from there. I have cattle to deliver and a payday waiting at Buford, and if the men on those horses catch up to her before she gets to town..." Ethan looked out at the empty landscape and did not answer. That afternoon, when Lillian emerged from the back room looking better, but still carrying the haunted expression of someone who had not yet fully returned from whatever dark place the crash had sent her, Ethan decided to force the issue. He waited until she was sitting at the table with coffee and bread. Then he reached into the carpet bag he had set aside and pulled out the book. He placed it on the table between them, open to the inside cover where the inscription read in neat, careful handwriting, "Property of Lillian Moore, Philadelphia." The silence that followed had a weight to it. Lillian looked at the book, looked at Ethan. Her jaw tightened and her eyes went hard in a way that reminded him of men preparing for a fight they knew they could not win. "I have my reasons," she said. "Every liar has reasons. What I need to know is whether yours are putting me and that baby in danger." She told him some of it then. That her real name was Lillian Moore, that she was a schoolteacher from Philadelphia, that a powerful man there had threatened her and she had fled west under an assumed name, that she had no connection to the attack on the stagecoach beyond being in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Ethan listened and knew she was telling him maybe half the truth. There were gaps in the story big enough to ride a horse through, places where her eyes shifted and her words got careful in a way that spoke of deliberate omission rather than poor memory. But he had learned a long time ago that you could not force the whole truth out of someone who was not ready to give it. You could only make clear what the cost of withholding it would be. "You do not have to tell me everything," he said. "But if someone is hunting you, and you are hiding that from me, then you are using my life as a shield without asking my permission. And I have got a problem with that." The words hit her. He could see it in the way she flinched, a small movement quickly controlled but real. She did not respond, and he did not push further. There would be time, or there would not. Either way, he had said what needed saying. Later that afternoon, while Lillian rested inside with the baby, Ethan rode back along the trail to check their surroundings. He told Martha he was scouting the route south toward Virginia City. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. He rode north first, back toward the stage route, following the tracks they had made the day before. When he reached the area near the crash site, he pulled Judge to a stop and studied the ground. Fresh tracks. At least 4 horses, the same number they had heard in the night, had come back to the wreck site after Ethan and Lillian left. The luggage had been searched again, more thoroughly this time. Every trunk emptied, every bag turned inside out, even the stage seats torn open with a knife. Whoever these men were, they were looking for something small enough to be hidden in a lining or a fold of fabric. And they were getting more desperate. And on the side of the overturned coach, carved into the wood with the tip of a blade, Ethan found a mark. A symbol he did not recognize, something like a letter or a brand, cut into the wood with deliberate care. It felt like a signature, like someone leaving a message that said, "I was here, and I will be back." Ethan traced the mark with his finger and felt the familiar tightening in his gut that came with bad news getting worse. These were not random road agents working an opportunity. These were organized men with a specific target and the patience to keep hunting until they found it. Whatever Lillian Moore was hiding, it was worth killing over. He rode back to the station as the sun was dropping toward the western hills. He found Lillian sitting on the porch with Sarah sleeping in her arms, staring at the Highwood Mountains to the south like she could see something terrible coming down from the peaks. He did not tell her about the carved mark. He did not tell her that the killers had been back to the wreck. Some truths, he decided, could wait until morning, but his hand stayed on the colt at his hip for the rest of the night, and he did not sleep at all. In 2 days at Jensen Station, Lillian counted 14 lies that Ethan told. Most were small things, harmless. Telling Martha the coffee was good when it clearly was not. Saying his shoulder was fine when she could see him favoring it. Claiming he had slept when the dark circles under his eyes said otherwise. But twice when he stood on the porch and looked toward the Highwood Mountains, his eyes became someone else's eyes entirely. Distant and haunted, and full of something that frightened her more than any midnight rider. The first day passed in a rhythm of cautious domesticity that felt strange after the violence and terror of the previous days. Martha Jensen ran her station with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had survived 3 decades on the frontier by never wasting a motion or a word. She fed them, gave Lillian clean clothes from her own wardrobe, and handled baby Sarah with the practiced ease of someone who had raised children of her own. Ethan, unable to sit still even when his body was begging for rest, spent the morning repairing Martha's corral fence. Lillian watched him from the porch while she nursed Sarah, fascinated despite herself by the focused violence of the labor. He split fence posts with a heavy maul, swinging with a precision that spoke of years of physical work. He strung wire with hands that bled at the knuckles and did not seem to notice or care. Sweat soaked through his shirt, and she could see the muscles moving beneath the fabric, the body of a man who had been using himself hard for a very long time. But it was the burn scar that held her attention. Running from his left wrist to past his elbow, the skin puckered and discolored in a pattern that did not look like any accidental burn she had ever seen. The geometry was wrong, too deliberate, too contained, like someone had held their own arm in a fire and kept it there. That night, Lillian could not sleep. Sarah was restless, fussing in the makeshift cradle Martha had fashioned from a wooden crate and wool blankets, and Lillian walked her through the station's common room until the baby settled. On her way back to the bedroom, she glanced out the window and saw a figure behind the barn. Ethan, sitting on an upturned bucket with his back against the barn wall. And he was drinking. Not the way men drink socially, with conversation and companionship and the easy pleasure of whiskey shared. He was pouring it down his throat with his eyes clenched shut and his free hand shaking, drinking like a man trying to drown something that lived inside him and would not die. After a while he stood, walked 3 steps to the side, and vomited. Then he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, corked the bottle, and walked back toward the station with steps that were only slightly unsteady. By morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He was up before dawn, coffee in hand, already planning the day with Martha's husband, Henry. And if his eyes were red-rimmed, and his face was the color of old canvas, nobody mentioned it. That second night, something happened that changed the nature of their stay at Jensen Station. Past midnight, a sound woke Lillian from thin, restless sleep. A heavy shuffling from the direction of the corral, followed by the sharp whinny of a frightened horse. She heard Ethan's boots hit the floor in the next room, then the click of a rifle being cocked, and then Martha's voice low and urgent from the kitchen. Grizzly. In the corral yard. Must have smelled the horses. Ethan moved fast. He was out the door before Lillian had fully processed what Martha said. And through the window she could see him in the moonlight, advancing toward the corral where a massive dark shape was pressing against the fence rails. The horses were screaming, stamping, throwing themselves against the far side of the enclosure. He could not shoot. They both knew why without it being said. A gunshot would carry for miles across the open plain, and if the riders from the stage route were anywhere in range, it would bring them down on the station like wolves on a wounded deer. Instead, Ethan grabbed a fence post from the pile of materials left over from the day's repair work and jammed one end into the coals of the outdoor fire pit until it caught. Then he advanced on the bear with nothing but a burning stick and his own stubborn refusal to back down, shouting and banging the torch against anything metal he could reach. Martha was right behind him with a pot and a ladle, making enough noise for 3 people. Henry appeared from the barn side with a pitchfork, cutting off the bear's easiest escape route and herding it toward the open ground beyond the corral. And Lillian, without thinking about it, without anyone asking her to, found herself standing in the kitchen doorway with the Derringer pistol Martha kept behind the flour sack, covering Ethan's back. She did not know if she could actually shoot a grizzly with a pocket pistol. She strongly suspected she could not. But she stood there anyway. The bear, confronted by fire and noise and several angry humans who apparently had no sense of self-preservation, eventually decided there were easier meals to be found elsewhere. It turned and lumbered off into the darkness with a disgusted huff that sounded remarkably like a man who had been asked to leave a party before the good whiskey came out. In the aftermath, standing in the corral yard with the torches guttering and the horses still stamping and blowing, Ethan looked at Lillian standing in the doorway with the Derringer. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them that was not attraction, or not only attraction. It was recognition. The understanding that here were 2 people who did not freeze when things went wrong. The next morning, Ethan rode out to check the southern trail toward Virginia City. He said he wanted to scout the route, and that was probably true, but Lillian suspected he also needed to be alone with whatever demons had driven him to the whiskey bottle the night before. With Ethan gone, Lillian found herself alone with Martha for the first time. She was changing Sarah's diapers on the kitchen table, stripping the soiled cloth to wash it, when the inner lining of the diaper came loose and something fell out onto the table. A small notebook, leather-bound, its pages covered in tight, precise handwriting. It had been hidden in the fold of cloth so carefully that Lillian had changed a dozen diapers without finding it, and it would have remained hidden indefinitely if the lining had not worn through from the constant washing and rewashing of the past few days. Lillian stared at it. The ledger. Helen Garrett's last words came flooding back. The ledger is in the diaper lining. Take it to Judge Mercer in Virginia City. She reached for it, but Martha's hand got there first. The older woman picked up the notebook and opened it, and Lillian watched her face change. The color drained out of her cheeks. Her hands started to tremble. And when she spoke, her voice was different, harder, older, the voice of a woman who had been carrying a secret of her own. This is Helen's writing. I would know it anywhere. Lillian felt the ground shift beneath her. You knew her? Martha closed the notebook carefully as if it might explode. Helen Garrett was my friend. We knew each other during the war a long time ago, before I came west. She wrote to me 3 weeks past, Said she was coming through with evidence. Said if anything happened to her, I was to make sure it got to the right hands. She paused. I have been waiting for her. When you showed up with her baby, I knew. I knew before you said a word. Why did you not say anything? Because I do not show my cards until I have to. That is how you stay alive out here. Martha opened the notebook again and turned pages slowly. Lillian could see columns of dates, numbers, names. Martha read some of them aloud in a voice that shook. Weapon shipments, payments, names of buyers and the men who brokered the deals. And at the center of it all, one name appearing over and over, Colonel Silas Whitmore, Fort Benton. He is the commanding officer, Martha said, supposed to be keeping the peace. Instead, he is selling army rifles to outlaws and hostile bands, stirring up the trouble he is being paid to prevent. Every conflict he manufactures gets him more funding, more men, more power. Helen found out. She built this record. And Whitmore found out she built it. Which is why he sent men to kill everyone on that stage. Lillian said, it was not robbery. It was never robbery. Never. No, it was not. Martha looked at her with eyes that held both sympathy and steel. Listen to me, girl. Whitmore at Fort Benton ordered Helen killed. Do not send word to the fort. Do not trust Captain Garrett, Helen's husband. He is under Whitmore's command, and Whitmore will have gotten to him by now. And that cowboy of yours, she paused. He seems decent enough, but you do not know what he did in the war. Nobody in Montana is what they appear to be. Nobody. That night, baby Sarah would not stop crying. Teething, perhaps, or the fever returning, or just the accumulated distress of a tiny body that had been through too much in too few days. Lillian walked her, rocked her, sang to her, tried everything she could think of, and nothing worked. Ethan, returned from his scouting and apparently not planning to repeat the previous night's drinking, came into the common room and took the baby without asking. He settled Sarah against his chest, one big hand supporting her head, and began a slow, steady walk from one end of the room to the other. His steps had a rhythm to them, not quite a march, but close. And after 15 minutes of it, the baby's screams subsided to whimpers, and then to the hitching breaths that came before sleep. They traded her back and forth through the small hours. When one of them got tired, the other took over, and somewhere around 3 in the morning they both gave up on standing and slid down the wall to sit on the floor with their backs together and the sleeping baby laid on a blanket between them. Ethan talked then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper. Not because there was anyone to hear, but because some things can only be said quietly, in the dark, to someone you cannot see but can feel. Her name was Clara, my wife. Funny thing, you using that name. She did not die. That is what most people assume when I say I am not married anymore. They think she caught the fever or the cholera or any of the 100 things that kill women out here. But she did not die. She looked at me, walking through the door after 3 years of war with this arm and these nightmares that make me scream in my sleep, and she said, "You are not the man I married." He paused. Lillian could feel his shoulder blades moving against hers as he breathed. She was right. I was not. She left me for a dry goods merchant in St. Louis 6 months later, a man with a whole body and clean dreams and money in the bank. I do not blame her. I would have left me too. Lillian did not mean to say what she said next. It came out before the filter that usually caught dangerous truths could engage, pushed through by exhaustion and the strange intimacy of sitting back to back in the dark with a sleeping baby between them. The man I am running from. He sells children. Silence. Ethan's breathing changed. She felt his back stiffen against hers. What did you say? Lillian closed her eyes. She had said too much, but the words were already in the air and there was no taking them back. I said he sells children. Orphans from the workhouses. He sends them to coal mines where they work until they are used up. I found out and tried to stop it, and he destroyed my life instead. More silence. Then Ethan said a word that Lillian would not repeat in polite company, a single raw syllable that contained more genuine emotion than anything he had said since she met him. And that was how they sat when the sun came up. Back to back on the floor of a way station in Montana Territory, with a sleeping baby between them and the biggest secret still unspoken. Because Lillian had told him about Ashford, but she had not told him about the ledger. Not yet. She was not sure she ever would. But the world made that decision for her. Just past dawn, while Martha was frying bacon and Henry was feeding the horses, and Lillian was trying to coax Sarah into taking some water from a rag, the sound of a single horse approaching at a walk brought everyone to the windows. A soldier, young, maybe 20, wearing the blue uniform of the United States Army. He rode up to the station with the stiff formality of someone carrying official business, and dismounted with a letter in his hand. Ethan was on the porch before the soldier's boots hit the ground, his hand resting on the butt of the Colt, though not drawing it. The soldier looked nervous, which was understandable given that Ethan, in a bad mood, looked like the kind of man who ate nervous soldiers for breakfast. "I am looking for the Jensen Way Station," the soldier said. "I have orders from Colonel Whitmore at Fort Benton." Martha came to the door. Henry appeared from the barn. And Lillian, standing just inside with Sarah in her arms, felt the blood drain from her face as the soldier read the letter aloud. By order of Colonel Silas Whitmore, commanding officer Fort Benton, the orphaned infant recovered from the recent stagecoach accident on the Helena Road is to be transferred immediately to Fort Benton for military wardship pending location of surviving family members. Martha read the letter over the soldier's shoulder and went white. Lillian pulled Sarah against her chest so hard the baby squawked in protest. And Ethan, for the first time since they had met, drew his gun. Ethan had shot men before. At Shiloh, at Chickamauga, at places that had no names on any map and no markers for the dead. But he had never in his life pointed a weapon at a soldier of the United States Army in broad daylight, in front of 2 women and a baby. And it occurred to him that the fact he was doing it now said something about how much he had changed in the span of 7 days. The soldier, to his credit, did not panic. He was young and frightened, but he was also trained, and he kept his hands visible and his voice steady as he said, "Sir, I am only delivering a message. I do not want trouble." "Neither do I," Ethan said, "but that baby is not going anywhere." What followed was a tense negotiation that lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but felt like an hour. Ethan did not put the gun away. The soldier did not reach for his own sidearm, and between them a fiction was constructed that would buy time if nothing else. Ethan claimed to be a deputy county sheriff, which was a lie. He claimed the child was under civilian legal jurisdiction, and that the Army had no authority to take custody without a proper court order, which was close enough to true that the soldier could not confidently contradict it. And he suggested, in a tone that made the suggestion sound very much like a warning, that the soldier return to Fort Benton and tell his colonel that if he wanted the child, he could send a judge and proper papers and do things the legal way. The soldier considered his options. He was alone, outnumbered, and facing a man with a drawn weapon and the look of someone who had stopped caring about consequences. He chose discretion. "I will report back to the colonel, but he will send someone else, and it will not be just me next time." After the soldier rode away, Ethan holstered the Colt and turned to find 3 women looking at him with 3 very different expressions. Martha's face was grim with the understanding of what this meant. Lillian's was torn between gratitude and terror. And baby Sarah, blissfully unaware of military jurisdiction and legal fictions, was chewing on a corner of her blanket. "We have maybe 24 hours, Ethan said. When that boy gets back to Fort Benton and tells Whitmore what happened, there will not be a polite letter next time. There will be a patrol, or worse." Martha moved first. She disappeared into the back of the station and returned with 2 things. A piece of paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map showing a mountain route from the station to Virginia City, a path that wound through the Highwood Mountains along trails too narrow for wagons and too rough for a cavalry column. And a small pistol, a Derringer pocket gun with a pearl handle worn smooth from years of use. "Helen left this with me," Martha said, pressing the gun into Lillian's hand. She said if things went wrong, I should make sure whoever had the ledger had a way to defend themselves. Now it is yours. Now it is. Lillian took the gun, and Martha's hand closed over hers for a moment. The older woman's grip was strong, and her eyes were fierce. Judge Mercer in Virginia City, Martha said. He is the one man in the territory with enough authority and enough backbone to use that ledger against Whitmore. Get it to him. Do not trust anyone in uniform on the way. Do not stop longer than you have to. And do not, under any circumstances, let them take that baby. Whatever Whitmore wants, it is in that child's belongings. He will tear her diapers to pieces if he gets his hands on her. What followed was the conversation Ethan had been dreading. Lillian told him what she should have told him from the beginning. About the ledger hidden in the baby's diapers. About Helen Garrett's dying instructions. About Judge Mercer and Virginia City. About Colonel Whitmore and the weapons smuggling operation that had gotten 3 people killed on a lonely stretch of Montana road. She told him all of this while standing in Martha's kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the smell of bacon still hanging in the air. And with each word she spoke, Ethan felt the walls of his carefully constructed life closing in around him. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said what needed to be said. You are asking me to abandon 14 head of cattle, 6 months of my wages, everything I have been working toward, to escort you across 200 miles of mountain trail with a baby while running from the United States Army, based on the word of a woman who has lied to me at least 3 times since I pulled her out of a ditch. Lillian met his eyes. Yes, that is exactly what I am asking. The silence stretched. Ethan thought about the 40 acres near Judith Basin, thought about the years of saving and planning and denying himself every comfort to put money aside for that land. Thought about Clara walking out the door with her suitcase and her new man's arm around her waist, and the promise he had made himself afterward, that he would never again sacrifice his own interest for someone else's cause. Then he thought about the baby, about the way Sarah reached for Lillian's face with those tiny grasping fingers, about Helen Garrett dying on the ground with her arms stretched toward the willows where her daughter sat in the care of a stranger, about what it meant when men with power decided that other people's children were acceptable losses. All right, he said. Then he added, because he was Ethan Cole and he could not help himself, but you lie to me one more time, just once, and I leave you on the trail. They left within the hour. Martha packed food and what supplies she could spare. Henry provided an extra horse, a sturdy buckskin that had seen better days, but was mountain sure. And Ethan stood in the corral and did the hardest thing he had done since coming home from the war. He opened the gate and let the cattle go. 14 head, 6 months of work. The Buford payday, the rent money, the winter provisions, every dollar he had been counting toward his 40 acres. He watched them scatter across the plain, dumb animals with no understanding of what they represented, just walking away into the grass and the heat and the vast indifference of Montana. His hands clenched at his sides until the knuckles went white. His jaw locked so tight the muscles stood out like rope. But he did not make a sound. He just stood there and watched his dream walk away from him on 4 hooved feet at a time. And when the last cow had disappeared into the shimmer of the plain, he turned his back and went to saddle Judge. They left Jensen Station, heading south, following Martha's hand-drawn map into the foothills of the Highwood Mountains. The trail was narrow and steep almost immediately, switching back and forth across rocky slopes that made the horses step carefully and the riders hold their breath. Within an hour, the station had disappeared behind them, and there was nothing but mountains and sky, and the thin ribbon of trail carved into the earth by generations of hunters and travelers. Ethan led. Lillian followed on the buckskin, Sarah strapped to her chest in the makeshift sling. Behind them, the pack horse carried their supplies and the salvaged luggage. The day was hot even at altitude, and the air smelled of pine and dust and the dry electric scent that meant weather was coming. They did not talk. There was nothing left to say that did not involve either the ledger or the future, And both of those topics felt too large and too dangerous for the narrow trail they were navigating. So they rode in silence and let the mountains close around them like a door being pulled shut on the world below. That first night on the mountain trail, they camped in a small clearing above a creek, where pine trees provided cover and a rock overhang gave them shelter from the wind. Lillian fed Sarah while Ethan built a fire small enough to cook over, but not large enough to be seen from any distance. They ate dried beef and hard biscuits and drank coffee that was more wish than substance, and neither of them mentioned the cattle or the money or the future. After Sarah fell asleep, Lillian sat near the fire and stared into the flames while Ethan took first watch. The night sounds of the mountains settled around them, the creek below, an owl somewhere in the pines, the distant lonely howl of a wolf that seemed to be asking a question nobody could answer. And then, in the flickering light, Ethan saw something move on the cliff above them. A figure, standing motionless on the rock ledge, looking down at their camp. Not one of the riders from the stage route, not a soldier. A woman, old, silver-haired, with a face like carved stone, and the bearing of someone who had been standing on that rock since before the mountains were named. A crow woman. She looked down at the camp, and her eyes found the baby sleeping in Lillian's arms, and she stayed there for a long moment. Then she was gone, dissolved into the darkness as if she had never been there at all. Ethan said nothing, but he noticed that the place where she had been standing was directly above a narrow passage through the rock, a gap between two boulders that led to a trail heading south. A trail that was not on Martha's map. He made a mental note of it and settled in for a long night of watching. Somewhere below them, the wolves continued their conversation, and above them the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human drama playing out beneath their light. On the third day of the mountains, the condensed milk ran out. Sarah screamed until her voice broke, and Lillian realized a terrible truth. She had begun to love this child, and loving something you could not keep was the most dangerous thing that could happen to a woman who had already lost everything else. The Highwood Crossing was nothing like Lillian had imagined mountain travel would be. In her Philadelphia education, mountains were things you read about in poetry. Noble peaks wreathed in clouds, inspiring awe and contemplation. The reality was a narrow trail barely wider than a horse, carved into the side of a cliff face with a 200-foot drop on one side and a wall of crumbling rock on the other. Rain had come in the night, sudden and savage, and the trail had turned to something between mud and grease that made every step an exercise in controlled terror. Judge went lame on the second day. The big horse slipped on wet shale and came down hard on his left foreleg. And though he tried to keep walking, the limp was unmistakable. Ethan climbed down and ran his hands along the leg with the careful attention of a man who knew horses the way a doctor knew the human body. And when he straightened up his face, told Lillian everything she needed to know. Strained but not broken, he said, "He can carry a light load but not a rider. We walk from here." So they walked. Ethan led Judge by the rein, the horse limping but game, carrying only the saddle and the lightest of their supplies. Lillian carried Sarah in the chest sling and led the buckskin, which carried everything else. The pack horse followed behind on a lead rope, and the whole caravan moved at a pace that would have embarrassed a tortoise. The condensed milk ran out on the third morning. They had been stretching it, diluting it with water until it was barely white, and now it was gone entirely. Sarah knew the difference. She was hungry, and she was angry about it, and she expressed her displeasure with a sustained scream that echoed off the canyon walls and probably announced their position to anyone within 5 miles. Lillian tried water. Sarah spat it out. She tried soaking a cloth in sugar water. Sarah turned her head away. In desperation, Lillian did something she had not planned and could not explain afterward. Something that came from a place deeper than thought or training. She took a piece of jerky from the provisions bag, put it in her own mouth, and chewed it until it was soft enough to be almost liquid. Then she pressed her lips to Sarah's mouth and fed her the way a mother bird feeds its young, mouth to mouth, warm and intimate and completely instinctive. Sarah took it. She sucked the softened meat from Lillian's lips with the fierce, single-minded intensity of the very young. And when she was done, she looked up at Lillian with those unfocused blue eyes and made a sound that might have been satisfaction. Lillian sat on a rock with the baby in her arms and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not break. Crack open. Like a seed splitting its hull to let the green thing inside it reach for the light. She was falling in love with this child. Not the distant affection of a caretaker for a charge, but the consuming impossible love that obliterates rational thought and replaces it with a single burning imperative. Protect. Keep. Mine. It was selfish, and she knew it. Sarah was not hers. Sarah had a father, a man Lillian had never met, who was at this moment probably sick with grief and searching for his daughter. She had no right to this feeling, no claim to make, nothing to offer except the fact that she was here, and she had promised. But the heart does not operate on rights and claims. The heart is a wild animal that goes where it will, and Lillian's had decided without consulting her that this baby belonged to her in some way that transcended law and blood and circumstance. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever felt, because loving something you could not keep meant that giving it up would destroy a part of you. And Lillian had already been destroyed once. On the fourth afternoon, the mountains tried to kill them. They were descending a steep section of trail that wound through a narrow canyon when the path ahead was suddenly blocked. Not by a fallen tree or a rock slide, but by two horses standing broadside across the trail. And on those horses, two men. The man on the left was unremarkable. Medium build, trail dusty, the kind of hired gun you could find in any saloon west of the Mississippi. But the man on the right was sitting on a pinto horse with a distinctive white blaze on its face shaped like a bolt of lightning, and something about his posture, the easy confidence of it, the patience, made Lillian's blood go cold before she even saw his face. He tipped his hat. "Good afternoon, Miss Moore." Not Clara Bennett, not ma'am. Her real name spoken with the casual precision of someone reading from a document. Boone. It had to be. The voice she had heard in the darkness that night on the trail, giving orders in short clipped sentences, hoarse and distinctive, like gravel dragged across tin. Up close, he was not what she expected, not the brute she had imagined. He was perhaps 45, lean-faced, clean-shaven, with light-colored eyes that held a patient intelligence more frightening than any display of anger could have been. He looked like a man who had all the time in the world and enjoyed using it to make other people uncomfortable. "Miss Moore," he said again, as if her silence required filling. "The Colonel sends his regards. He is a reasonable man, and he has authorized me to make you a very reasonable offer." Ethan had moved to put himself between Lillian and the two riders, his hand on the colt, but Boone raised a palm. "Easy, drover. Nobody needs to die today. Not you, not the woman, not the baby. The Colonel only wants the ledger. Hand it over and you both walk free. The child goes back to her father where she belongs. Simple. Clean. Nobody else needs to get hurt." The worst part was how tempting it sounded. Lillian felt the pull of it like a physical force. Just give him the ledger. End this. Walk away alive with Ethan and find somewhere quiet, and let someone else worry about justice and corruption and the complicated machinery of powerful men destroying the lives of those who threaten their power. She could feel Ethan behind her, tense as a drawn bow, and she turned to look at him. She was looking for permission, she realized, for someone to tell her what to do, to make the decision so she would not have to carry the weight of it. Ethan shook his head, just shook his head, did not say a word. And Lillian, in the moment that would define the rest of her life, turned back to Boone and said the word that changed everything. Number. Boone smiled. It was a genuine smile, almost appreciative, the smile of a man who respected courage even in an adversary. "That is unfortunate," he said. Then he drew his pistol and shot Judge. The bullet hit the horse in the neck and Judge went down like a building collapsing, his legs folding under him all at once. He made a sound that Lillian would hear in her nightmares for years, a high, wild scream that cut off abruptly as his body hit the ground. The other horses panicked, rearing and pulling at their reins, And in the chaos, Boone and his companions simply turned and rode away. "Next time I shoot the man," Boone called over his shoulder. And then they were gone around the bend of the canyon, and the only sounds were the wind and the stamping of the frightened horses and the terrible silence where Judge used to be. Ethan was kneeling beside his horse before the echoes died. His hand was on Judge's neck, feeling for a pulse that was not there. And the expression on his face was something Lillian had never seen before and hoped never to see again. It was not grief exactly. It was something beyond grief. Something that lived in the space between losing something you loved and realizing you were the reason it was gone. He did not speak for 6 hours. In those 6 hours, he dug a grave. The ground was rocky and hard, and the folding shovel from the pack was meant for campfire trenches, not horse burials. But Ethan dug as if the digging itself was the only thing keeping him from flying apart. The shovel hit rock, and he moved the rock. It hit root, and he cut the root. He dug for 2 hours in the fading light until the hole was deep enough. Then he unsaddled Judge, removed the bridle, folded the saddle blanket, and laid it over the horse's face, a gesture so tender that Lillian had to look away. He lowered Judge into the grave with a system of ropes and leverage that must have taken enormous strength, though his face showed nothing at all. And he covered the horse with earth, one shovelful at a time, until there was nothing left to see but a mound of fresh-turned dirt in a mountain clearing. He did not plant a cross, did not say a word, did not pray or weep or give any outward sign that the animal he had just buried had been his companion for 4 years, the only living creature he had allowed himself to care about since his wife walked out the door with another man's name on her lips. He just stood there for a while. Then he picked up the saddle, slung it over his shoulder like it weighed nothing, and started walking south. Lillian stood and followed. Sarah slept. The wind blew, and the prairie swallowed it all like nothing had ever happened. That night, Lillian lay in the dark and listened to Ethan weep. Not aloud. The sound was barely there at all, just broken breathing and the faint tremor of shoulders shaking. She wanted to go to him, wanted to put her hand on his back and say something, anything that might ease the weight of what he had lost. But going to him now meant admitting that she was the reason. Her choice had led them here. Her refusal to give Boone the ledger had cost Ethan the last thing in the world he loved. She lay still and hated herself, and in the silence between his grief and her guilt, baby Sarah breathed soft and steady and unaware, dreaming whatever dreams a baby dreams when the world has already taken her mother and given her to strangers. Virginia City smelled like money and desperation, gold dust and whiskey and sweat and the dead dreams of 10,000 men who believed fortune would come if they just dug 1 foot deeper. They arrived on the 8th day after leaving Jensen Station, and Lillian was not sure how either of them was still upright. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, and the dress Martha had given her hung on her frame like a scarecrow's wardrobe. Her feet were blistered inside her boots, and her shoulders ached from carrying Sarah in the sling, and every joint in her body felt like it had been packed with sand and set on fire. But baby Sarah was healthy, fat-cheeked and bright-eyed and growing like a weed despite the milk shortage and the mountain crossing and everything else the world had thrown at her. The baby had become the measure of their success. If Sarah thrived, they were doing something right. Virginia City sprawled across the gulch in a chaos of wooden buildings and tent structures, with mine tailings piled behind the town like the droppings of some enormous beast. The main street was mud and boards and the constant traffic of wagons and horses and men in varying states of sobriety. It was loud and dirty and vibrant, and after 8 days of mountain silence, it was almost overwhelming. Ethan had barely spoken since Judge died. He moved and functioned and did what needed doing. But there was a distance in him now, a wall that had gone up between his inner self and the outer world, and Lillian was not sure she had the right to ask him to take it down. They found a boarding house on the edge of town, a dingy establishment run by a woman with suspicious eyes and no interest in names or stories. Ethan paid for a room with some of the small amount of money he had left, and they settled Sarah on the bed and tried to remember what civilization felt like. Ethan went out to find Judge Mercer. He came back an hour later with a face like stone and sat down on the edge of the bed without saying a word. Lillian knew. She knew before he opened his mouth because she had become fluent in the language of Ethan's silences, and this one said something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Mercer is dead," Ethan said. "2 weeks ago. They say he fell from a horse. Nobody believes it. Nobody is willing to say otherwise." The room tilted. Lillian felt the floor move under her feet, and the walls lean in and the ceiling press down, and for a moment she could not breathe. 200 miles. 8 days of mountain trail. Judge dead. The cattle gone. Everything sacrificed. Everything risked. For this. For a dead man. She made it to the street before the breakdown took her. She did not plan it, and she could not stop it. She just sat down in the dirt in front of the boarding house with Sarah in her arms and opened her mouth and screamed, not words, just sound. The raw animal sound of someone who has been holding everything together through sheer force of will and has finally, irrevocably, come apart. People stared. A man in mining clothes stopped and asked if she was all right. A woman across the street pulled her children inside, and Ethan, who had followed her out, did the only thing there was to do. He picked her up. Baby and all, he lifted her off the ground and carried her back inside and set her on the bed and closed the door against the world. The screaming stopped eventually. The tears did not. They came in waves, ugly and graceless, the kind of crying that sounds like choking and looks like dying and cannot be prettied up or made presentable. Lillian cried for Helen Garrett, and for Judge Mercer, and for the 14 cattle scattered across a Montana plain, and for the horse buried in a mountain clearing, and for the children in the coal mines that nobody would help, and for the baby in her arms that she loved and could not keep, and for the life she had left in Philadelphia that had been built on lies, and for the life she was trying to build here that was collapsing faster than she could hold it together. When the storm passed, Ethan was sitting in the chair by the window. He had been watching her the way you watch a fire, waiting to see if it would burn itself out or spread. His voice when he spoke was not kind. It was not cruel either. It was something harder and more honest than either. "You led me 200 miles to a dead man. I lost my cattle. I lost my horse. I lost a year's wages and the only dream I had left. And you knew, did you not? You knew there was a chance he might not be here. You knew, and you dragged me along anyway. I did not know he was dead." Lillian's voice was raw from screaming. "I swear I did not know. But you knew Whitmore was looking for that ledger. You knew the men who killed Helen Garrett were still out there hunting for it. You knew all of that before you asked me to give up everything and follow you into these mountains. And you did not tell me the full truth until I had already lost too much to turn back. I was trying to do the right thing. The right thing." Ethan's voice was very quiet, which was worse than shouting. "You have lied to me from the first moment we met. Fake name, fake story. You hid the ledger from me for days. You used my protection without telling me what I was protecting you from. Which right thing are we talking about exactly?" Lillian had no defense. She could have argued, could have pointed out that she had been in shock, that she had been following a dead woman's instructions, that she had been afraid. All of it was true. None of it was enough. So she told him everything, from the beginning. William Ashford, the children in the coal mines, the discovery, the accusation, the destruction of her career, the flight west, Clara Bennett, the stage ride with Helen Garrett, the dying whisper about the ledger. All of it laid out on the dirty floor of a Virginia City boarding house without defense or explanation or apology. Just facts, as bare and ugly as the truth always is when you strip away the comfortable layers of omission and self-justification. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Sarah had fallen asleep on the bed, unaware that her future was being discussed in the space between two people who had hurt each other badly enough to wonder if the hurting would ever stop. Ethan sat in his chair and looked at the baby, then at Lillian. Something moved behind his eyes. Not forgiveness. That was too much to ask, and Lillian was smart enough not to ask for it. But something. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Earlier that day, walking through Virginia City's crowded streets looking for information about Mercer, Ethan had passed a man begging outside a saloon. Skeletal, one-armed, wearing the faded remnants of a Confederate uniform. Their eyes had met, and the man had said, "Cole, that you? Thought you died at the creek crossing." Amos Fenton, who had served in Ethan's regiment at Chickamauga, a man who had followed orders, served a cause, sacrificed everything, and been thrown away when the cause was done. That encounter was sitting in Ethan's chest like a stone, because he recognized the pattern. He was doing it again, following a mission, sacrificing his future, destroying himself for a purpose that might not give a damn about him when it was finished. The war all over again, wearing different clothes. But the baby slept on the bed, and there were children in coal mines. And somewhere a dead woman named Helen Garrett had risked everything she had to build a record of a powerful man's crimes. And all that was left of her courage was a small leather notebook and a 6-month-old girl with her mother's eyes. Mercer was not the only man with authority in Montana, Ethan said slowly. There is a lawyer in Helena named Thomas Beckett. Used to edit the Helena Independent before he went into law. If that ledger is real, he will know what to do with it. Helena is 3 more days. Yes, it is. Can you make it? Lillian looked at him. The question underneath the question was clear. Not can you physically travel 3 more days, but are you willing to keep going when every rational reason to stop has been exhausted? The question is whether you will, she said. You have lost enough because of me. I am not going for you. Ethan's voice was hard, but certain. I am going because if there is a man selling children somewhere in this country, and I know about it and do nothing, then I am no different from what I was at Shiloh. He did not explain what he meant by that. But the way he said it, flat and final, and carrying the weight of 20 years of guilt, told Lillian there was a story behind those words that she would hear someday when he was ready to tell it. They left the next morning. And as they walked out of the boarding house into the early light, Lillian saw something nailed to a lamp post that stopped her dead on the boardwalk. A handbill, fresh printed, the ink still sharp. Wanted, it said in bold letters. Clara Bennett, alias Lillian Moore. Theft of military property. Child abduction. Reward $200. And below the text, a description that was close enough to be unmistakable. And at the bottom, a signature. Colonel Silas Whitmore, Fort Benton. Lillian tore the handbill down and shoved it into her pocket. But she had seen others, 3 or 4 at least, posted along the main street. Whitmore was not just hunting them now. He had made it official. In the eyes of the territory, Lillian Moore was a criminal, and anyone who helped her was an accessory. She looked at Ethan. He had seen the posters, too. His jaw was set and his eyes were dark, and whatever wall had been between them since Judge died was still there, but underneath it, or maybe threaded through it, was something that looked very much like resolve. We need to move fast, he said. And they did. Lillian Moore entered Helena with her face on a wanted poster, a kidnapped baby in her arms, and a Confederate drover as her only ally. If someone had told her this was a good plan, she would have laughed until she wept. Helena was bigger than Virginia City, more established, with real buildings of brick and stone alongside the wooden structures that made up most frontier towns. It was the territorial capital, which meant there were lawyers and journalists and politicians, the machinery of civilization that might, if properly engaged, provide the kind of justice that a gun could not. But it also meant soldiers, and those wanted posters had traveled faster than they had. They entered the city from the south, avoiding the main roads. Lillian covered her hair with a scarf and kept her head down. Ethan had shaved off his beard at their last camp, which changed his appearance enough that he looked like a different man, harder and younger and more dangerous without the softening effect of whiskers. They found a room in the poorest part of town, above a Chinese laundry on a street that smelled of lye soap and coal smoke. The landlord was a tired-looking man who accepted cash and did not ask for names. The room was small and dirty and contained a bed, a chair, and a washstand. and after 2 weeks of trail, it felt like a palace. Finding Thomas Beckett took most of the first day. The lawyer had an office above a hardware store on Main Street, a cramped space overflowing with paper and books, and the faint smell of whiskey that spoke of late nights and hard cases. Beckett himself was perhaps 50, sharp-featured, with silver hair and the watchful eyes of a man who had spent years observing human nature at its worst, and had not yet lost the capacity to be surprised by it. He was not happy to see them. "You are handing me a career suicide note," he said, after Ethan had explained the situation in broad terms, and Lillian had produced the ledger. A Confederate veteran and a woman wanted for child abduction walk into my office with a stolen military document accusing a Union colonel of arms smuggling and murder. "Do you have any idea what this looks like?" "It looks like the truth," Lillian said, "and you can verify it." Beckett took the ledger. He was going to send them away. Lillian could see it in the set of his mouth, the way he held the notebook like something that might bite. Then he opened it and started reading. The change was gradual. A frown first, then a stillness, then a slow, focused intensity as his eyes moved down the columns of dates and names and figures. He turned pages, went back, turned more. His finger traced a line of entries, and his breath caught. "I know this name," he said quietly. "I investigated this man 3 years ago when I was still writing for The Independent. My source disappeared before I could publish." He turned another page. "And this one. This is a freight company I traced shipments through but could never connect to anyone at Fort Benton." He looked up. "Where did you get this?" "Helen Garrett compiled it," Lillian said. "She was killed for it, and Colonel Whitmore has been hunting us since we found it." Beckett read for another 20 minutes. When he put the ledger down, his face held an expression Lillian had not seen before, a mixture of excitement and dread that she recognized from her own experience as the look of someone who has found the proof they always suspected existed and is now confronting the reality of what it will cost to use it. "I need 3 days," he said. 3 days to verify key entries against records I can access, to contact sources who can corroborate, and to prepare a filing for the Territorial Prosecutor's Office. If this ledger holds up, and I believe it will, Whitmore faces a court-martial and criminal prosecution. He paused. "But I need you alive and free for those 3 days. Can you manage that?" "We have managed worse," Ethan said. The 3 days that followed were the longest of Lillian's life. She and Ethan stayed in the room above the laundry, going out only when absolutely necessary. Sarah was growing, changing in the small ways that babies change when you are watching closely enough to notice. She could grab fingers now, wrapping her tiny hand around Lillian's index finger with a grip that was surprisingly strong. She turned her head to find Lillian's voice when she spoke, and she had started making sounds that were more than crying. Small experimental noises that seemed to be testing the machinery of language. Each of these developments made Lillian's heart ache a little more, because every sign of Sarah's growth was a reminder that this baby was becoming a person, a real individual human person, and that person was going to be taken from her. Given to Captain Garrett if things went well, or seized by Whitmore if they did not. Either way, Lillian's time with Sarah was running out. On the second day, Lillian had to go out. Sarah needed milk, real milk, and the supply they had bought on the first day was gone. It was a practical necessity that could not be avoided, and Ethan was out meeting with Beckett to review the verification, so Lillian had no choice but to go alone. She wrapped Sarah in a blanket, covered her own hair with the scarf, and stepped onto the street. Helena was busy in the afternoon, wagons and riders and pedestrians going about their business with the single-minded energy of a frontier capital in its growth years. Lillian kept her head down and moved quickly, making for the general store 2 blocks away. She was halfway there when she saw the soldiers, 2 of them in the blue uniform of Fort Benton, standing on a corner with a sheaf of handbills. They were checking faces. Not aggressively, not stopping people, but watching the crowd with the steady patience of men who had been told to find someone and were willing to take as long as it took. Lillian's first instinct was to freeze. Her second was to run. She did neither. Instead, she felt something click into place inside her. The same cold calculation that had kept her alive in Philadelphia when she was gathering evidence against Ashford, and she became someone else. She straightened her spine, changed her walk from hurried to casual, adjusted Sarah on her hip so the baby's face was hidden against her shoulder. And when she passed the soldiers, she smiled at them, a pleasant, vacant smile, the smile of a woman who had nothing more important on her mind than buying milk for her baby. One of the soldiers glanced at her. Lillian felt her heart stop. Then he looked away and went back to scanning the crowd. She bought the milk. She walked back to the boarding house. She climbed the stairs to the room and closed the door and leaned against it and shook so hard her teeth rattled. She had used the lying. The thing she hated most about herself, the compulsive instinct to become whoever the situation required, the chameleon skin she had worn so long it felt like her real face sometimes. She had used it, and it had saved her life and Sarah's life. And the realization that arrived with the shaking was this. The thing she was most ashamed of was also the thing that had kept her alive. People were not all one thing. Flaws and strengths were the same trait in different light. That evening, after Sarah was fed and sleeping, Ethan came back from Beckett's office and sat in the chair by the window. He was tired. Lillian could see that. But there was something else in his face, too. A decision being made, or having been made, or trying to be made. Beckett says the ledger checks out, he said. Every entry he has been able to verify matches records he has been collecting for years. He is going to file tomorrow. Send copies to 3 newspapers and the governor's office. Once it is out there, Whitmore cannot bury it. Good, Lillian said. That is good. Silence settled between them. Not the hostile silence of the past few days, but something older and more complicated. The silence of 2 people sitting in a room together who know they are going to say things that cannot be unsaid. Ethan spoke first. My wife's name was Clara, he said. I told you that. But I did not tell you why she left. Not the real why. It was not just the arm or the nightmares. Those were her excuse. The real reason was Shiloh. Lillian waited. I was 19 years old, he said. I was so scared I could not think straight. We were supposed to destroy a Union supply depot. I was the one with the matches. It was dark and everything was chaos, and I set the fire like they told me to, and it burned. He paused. I found out later there were wounded men inside, both sides. Union and Confederate, sheltering together, because when you are shot and bleeding, the color of the uniform does not matter much. I did not know they were in there, but I heard them screaming after the fire took. His voice was flat, reciting facts, but Lillian could see his hands shaking in his lap. I told Clara about it one night after the nightmares woke us both. I thought she should know. I thought it was the right thing, telling the truth. She looked at me, and I could see it in her face. She was not seeing a man anymore. She was seeing a monster. He held up his left arm, the one with the burn scar. This was not from the depot. I did this to myself. 4 years after the war, in a cabin outside Bozeman, dead drunk on whiskey I could not afford. I held my arm in the fire and kept it there. I thought if I burned the same way they burned, it might even things out somehow. It did not. Lillian's first reaction was fear. She felt it move through her like cold water, the primal response to sitting close to someone who has just told you they once set fire to wounded men and then tried to burn themselves alive. She pulled her hand back from where it had been resting near his on the bed. She looked at him, and for the first time saw not the drover, not the protector, not the man who had buried his horse in silence and followed her across 200 miles of wilderness. She saw the killer, the 19-year-old boy with a match in his hand and a sound in his ears that would never stop. Ethan saw the fear. He stood up. I should not have told you, he said, and his voice was already closing, already retreating behind the wall. Lillian caught his hand, not because the fear was gone. It was not gone. It was right there, beating in her chest like a second heart. But she caught his hand and held it because she had spent months running from men who used power to destroy, and here was a man who had been destroyed by his own and was still somehow standing. She did not say anything wise. She did not offer forgiveness or absolution or any of the therapeutic phrases that sound good in drawing rooms and mean nothing in the dark. She said 2 words, "Do not go." He looked at her hand holding his, looked at her face, and he kissed her. It was not romantic. It was not smooth or practiced or any of the things a first kiss is supposed to be. It was clumsy and scared and lasted about 3 seconds before they both pulled back and stared at each other. "I am sorry," he said. "I should not have done that. Do not apologize. But do not do it again until you are doing it because you want to, not because you are hurting." He nodded, sat back down. And they sat together in the dying light, not touching, not talking, but no longer divided. There was a knock at the door that evening. Lillian opened it to find a man she had never seen. Tall, gaunt, wearing civilian clothes over a military bearing that he could not disguise. His eyes went immediately to the baby sleeping on the bed. "Are you Miss Moore?" he said. His voice was rough, like he had been using it to hold back sounds he did not want to make. "Who is asking?" "My name is James Garrett. Captain James Garrett. That is my daughter." Lillian felt everything inside her go still. She looked at this man, at the grief carved into his face and the way his hands were trembling at his sides, and she saw not a threat but a father. She let him in. She did not know why. She should have been afraid. Martha had warned her about Garrett, about Whitmore's influence over him. But there were no soldiers behind him. He was alone, and he was shaking. And when she lifted Sarah from the bed and placed her in his arms, he held his daughter the way you hold something sacred, with infinite care and the clear understanding that you are not worthy of what you have been given. Garrett cried. He tried not to. He turned his face away and bit his lip and did all the things men do when they believe crying is weakness. But the tears came anyway, running down his weathered face and falling on Sarah's blanket, and the baby, sensing something familiar in the scent or the warmth or the particular rhythm of his heartbeat, settled against his chest and sighed. He held her for 5 minutes. He did not mention Whitmore, did not mention the ledger, did not threaten or demand or negotiate. He just held his daughter and breathed and existed in the same space as the child he had been afraid he would never see again. Then he gave her back, carefully the way you hand someone a piece of your own heart. And he left, without a word. Lillian closed the door and stood there for a long time, Sarah warm and heavy in her arms. Garrett was cracking. She had seen it in his eyes. The fracture between duty and love, between survival and conscience, was widening with every hour. He had not broken yet, but the break was coming. The next morning, Beckett appeared at their door before sunrise. His face was pale and his hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee like he was trying to draw warmth from it. "Whitmore is in Helena," he said. "He arrived last night with 20 soldiers from Fort Benton, and he has Captain Garrett with him." Ethan checked the Colt. 6 rounds and not one to spare. 20 soldiers meant 20 chances to be wrong, but he only needed to be right once, long enough for Lillian and the baby to run. That was the plan he formed in the first 5 seconds after Beckett delivered the news. Simple, stupid, and likely fatal, which described most of Ethan's plans over the course of his life. Get between the danger and the people who mattered. Hold the line. Go down swinging if it came to that. But Beckett had a different kind of plan. The lawyer had not slept in 3 days, and it showed in his face, but his mind was working with the sharp, focused clarity of a man who understood that the next 12 hours would define his entire career. "I sent copies of the ledger to the Montana Gazette, the Helena Herald, and the governor's office last night," he said. "Express riders. By now, the governor has the evidence, and at least 2 newspaper editors are reading through Colonel Whitmore's crimes over their morning coffee. Whitmore cannot kill you without creating the very scandal he is trying to prevent." "He can arrest me," Lillian said. "The wanted poster gives him grounds. Child abduction, theft of military property. He can take me and Sarah and the original ledger, and then he has time to bury everything." Beckett nodded. That is exactly what he's going to try to do, which is why we are going to make sure he does it in public, with witnesses who carry notebooks and sharp pencils. The plan came together fast. Beckett sent word to both newspaper offices that a story of territorial significance would unfold that morning at the boarding house on Clark Street. He also sent a message to the governor's representative in Helena, a territorial prosecutor named Sullivan, who had the authority to intervene in civilian matters that exceeded military jurisdiction. Then they waited. The hardest part. The night before, there had been one more piece of violence. Boone, faithful to his nature, had come for them under cover of darkness. Ethan had expected it. He had sat in the alley behind the boarding house with his back against the wall and the Colt in his lap, waiting with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that the enemy always comes at night and always from the direction you least expect. Boone came from above. He had climbed to the roof of the adjacent building and dropped down into the alley with the soft-footed grace of a cat. And if Ethan had not heard the faintest scrape of boot on shingle, it would have been over before it started. What followed was not a gunfight. In the narrow dark of the alley, there was no room for drawn weapons and no light to aim by. It was a brawl, ugly and brutal and terrifying in its closeness. Boone had a knife and used it, opening a wound along Ethan's ribs that burned like a hot wire. Ethan had the Colt and used the butt of it, bringing it down on Boone's skull with a sound like a melon hitting stone. Boone went down. Ethan tied him with rope from the stable and dragged him to the corner of the alley, and then stood over him with the knife, Boone's own knife still slick with blood. The old darkness rose up, the Shiloh darkness. It whispered to him in a voice he recognized as his own, saying, "This is what you are good at. This is what you were made for. This man killed your horse. This man would have killed you. Finish it." His hand shook. The knife trembled at Boone's throat. Then Lillian was there. He had not heard her come out, but she was there, standing in the alley with the derringer in one hand and the other hand reaching for him. "If you kill him," she said, "you give Whitmore a murder charge to hold over you. You become his weapon instead of his enemy. Do not give him that. Do not give him you." Ethan's hand shook for a long time. Then the knife dropped, ringing on the cobblestones. By morning, Boone was tied and gagged in the stable. Beckett had documentation of the attack, and Ethan sat in a chair while Lillian wrapped his ribs with strips of torn bedsheet, her hands steady even though her face was white. Whitmore arrived at 10 o'clock. He came with a detachment of soldiers, a military adjutant carrying legal papers, and the kind of formal dignity that powerful men wear when they are doing terrible things and want to look respectable while doing them. He was taller than Lillian had expected, silver-haired, square-jawed, with the bearing of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed, and had never seriously considered the possibility that he would not be. His uniform was immaculate. His boots gleamed. He looked like a recruiting poster for everything that was right about the United States Army, and the contrast between his appearance and his crimes made Lillian feel physically sick. Behind him, in uniform, stood Captain Garrett. His face was a mask that revealed nothing except, if you looked closely enough, the faintest tremor at the corner of his mouth. "I am here for the child," Whitmore said, "and for the woman calling herself Lillian Moore, wanted on charges of theft and abduction. I have the proper documentation and the authority to enforce it. I trust there will be no further obstruction of military business." He said this to Beckett, who was standing on the boarding house steps with a calm that Lillian envied, and to the two men standing behind Beckett, one holding a notebook and the other a pencil. Reporters. Their eyes were moving from Whitmore to Lillian, to the baby and back again, and they were writing everything down. Whitmore saw them. Something flickered across his face, the briefest uncertainty, there and gone. But it was enough. "This is a military matter," he said. "I do not see how it concerns the press." Beckett stepped forward. "Colonel Whitmore, my name is Thomas Beckett. I represent Miss Moore in a civilian capacity. I also have in my possession and in the possession of 2 news offices and the territorial governor, a document alleging that you have been running a weapons smuggling operation out of Fort Benton for the past 3 years. I believe that makes it very much a matter for the press." The silence that followed was like the silence before a storm. Whitmore's face did not change, not visibly, but something behind his eyes shifted. The calculation of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath his feet is not as solid as he believed. Before anyone could speak, a carriage arrived. A man in a black suit stepped out, introduced himself as Sullivan, territorial prosecutor, and presented credentials that made even Whitmore pause. Sullivan had been sent by the governor to observe. His presence meant that whatever happened next would happen under the authority of the territorial government, not the military. Whitmore was trapped. He could not arrest Lillian without creating a public spectacle that would draw attention to the very accusations he was trying to suppress. He could not seize the ledger because copies were already in circulation. And he could not simply walk away because that would be an admission that his authority was not sufficient to accomplish what he had come to do. He turned to Garrett. "Captain," he said, "take the child." Garrett did not move. His eyes were on Sarah, who was in Lillian's arms, awake and alert and looking at the assembly of adults with the wide-eyed curiosity of a baby who does not understand why everyone is standing so still. "Captain," Whitmore said again, and this time his voice carried the steel of a direct order from a commanding officer to a subordinate. Garrett stepped forward. 1 step. 2. He was close enough now to touch the baby. Lillian could see his hands hanging at his sides, trembling. And then Sarah looked at him, looked directly at her father with those unfocused blue eyes, and she smiled. The first smile she had given him, a real smile, toothless and wide, her whole face crinkling with the simple, uncomplicated joy of recognition. She reached for him with both hands, making sounds that were almost words. Something broke in Garrett's face. The mask crumbled. The military bearing dissolved. What was left was just a man, a father, a human being standing at the intersection of duty and love and choosing. Finally, the thing that mattered. He took Sarah from Lillian's arms, gently, reverently, the way you pick up something infinitely precious and breakable. He held her against his chest, and she settled there with a sigh that seemed to say, "Finally, finally, this is where I belong." Then he turned, not toward Whitmore, toward the reporters. "My name is Captain James Garrett," he said. His voice was steady now, steadier than it had been in weeks. "My wife, Helen Garrett, was murdered on the orders of Colonel Silas Whitmore. I am prepared to testify to everything I know about his operations at Fort Benton." Nobody moved. The reporters wrote furiously. Sullivan, the prosecutor, stepped forward with the quiet authority of a man who had just been handed everything he needed. And Whitmore, Colonel Silas Whitmore, who had built an empire of weapons and corruption and murder on the Montana frontier, stood on a Helena street and watched it collapse. He was placed under arrest by Sullivan and 2 deputy marshals who had been standing by on the governor's orders. He would be escorted to the territorial prison at Deer Lodge to await court-martial proceedings. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all of it gone in the time it took a baby to smile at her father. As they led him away, Whitmore turned and looked at Lillian one last time. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "Ashford will learn where you are, and he is not like me. He does not quit." Lillian did not flinch. She was done being afraid of men who used power to destroy. She had faced the worst of it, and she was still standing. But beside her, Ethan heard every word, and his eyes went dark as the sky before a storm. 3 months later, when the first snow whitened the Bannock Valley, Lillian stood in front of her classroom and realized she was not running anymore. For the first time in 2 years, she was standing still, and the world was turning around her instead of the other way around. Whitmore's court-martial had been swift and thorough. The territorial court at Deer Lodge had heard the evidence, reviewed the ledger, taken testimony from Captain Garrett and a dozen other witnesses, and sentenced the colonel to 12 years in the territorial prison. His rank was stripped. His pension was gone. The empire he had built was dismantled one piece at a time by men with subpoenas, and the kind of patient bureaucratic fury that is, in its own quiet way, more devastating than any bullet. William Ashford was another matter. Beckett had sent copies of Lillian's testimony and supporting evidence to newspapers in Philadelphia, and the scandal had broken like a summer storm, sudden and loud and impossible to ignore. Ashford was indicted by a Pennsylvania grand jury, but he was wealthy and connected, and his lawyers were expensive and clever, and the trial had not yet begun. Justice, Lillian was learning, moved slowly when the accused had money. The children she had tried to save were still waiting. Ashford was still free. She had to live with that. It was not easy and it was not fair, and some nights it kept her awake, staring at the ceiling of her cabin in Bannock, and wondering if anything she had done had made any difference at all. But she had learned something in the months since the stagecoach crash. You could not control the outcome. You could only control whether the outcome consumed you. She chose to let it go, not forget, never forget. But let go of the need to see it finished before she could start living again. Captain Garrett wrote to her every month. Letters that arrived on the supply wagon from Fort Benton, written in a hand that started out military precise and gradually loosened into something more personal as the months passed. Sarah walks now, one letter said. She falls more than she stands, but she gets up every time, like her mother. I have not learned to sleep alone yet. But every morning when she calls me Pa, I remember why I am still here. Lillian read those letters in her cabin by lamplight and cried the kind of tears that are not grief exactly, but something close to it. The ache of loving someone you have chosen to let go. She wrote back. It took her 3 attempts and a full evening of staring at blank paper, but she wrote, Sarah is your daughter. I will always love her, but she needs her father. Not a woman trying to fill a hole in her own heart with someone else's child. That letter cost her more than anything she had ever written, more than the testimony against Ashford, more than the fake papers under the name Clara Bennett. Letting go of Sarah was letting go of the version of herself who needed to be needed. And what remained when that version was gone was something smaller and truer and harder to live with. But it was honest. And Lillian had decided, somewhere on the trail between Jensen's Station and Virginia City, that she was done with lies. Bannock was a dying town, and it did not care who knew it. The gold rush had played out years ago, and what remained was a community of stubborn people who had decided to build something lasting in a place the rest of the world had given up on. The school was a log building with a peaked roof and 2 windows and a pot-bellied stove that smoked when the wind blew from the east, which was most of the time. Lillian had 17 students, ages 6 to 15, and the range of abilities was staggering. Some could read and do sums. Some could not write their own names. The school board, headed by a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy Benson, had given Lillian a 3-month probationary period. 3 months to prove she could handle the students, the parents, and the frontier conditions that had driven away 3 previous teachers in 2 years. It did not go smoothly. In her first week, a boy named Jack Hoskins challenged her. He was 15, built like a young bull, with his father's size and an attitude that dared the world to give him a reason to use it. He showed up late, disrupted the younger students, and made it clear he considered school a waste of time. On the 3rd day, Jack made a comment about book learning being useless for real work. Lillian, exhausted and still raw from everything she had been through, snapped. She said something cutting about his father, about men who used their fists because their minds were not enough to get the job done. The room went dead silent, went dead. Jack's face changed. The defiant mask crumbled, and underneath it was something young and hurt and vulnerable. And Lillian realized with sick certainty that she had just become exactly the kind of adult he expected, the kind that used words to wound. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her cabin and reviewed every mistake she had ever made, and added this one to the top of the list. The next morning, she stood in front of her classroom and said, "Jack, I owe you an apology. What I said yesterday about your father was wrong, and it was cruel, and I had no right to say it. I am sorry." 17 children stared at her. They had never seen an adult apologize, not for anything, not ever. Adults yelled and punished and sometimes hit and always had a reason that made it someone else's fault. An adult standing in front of them and saying I was wrong without excuse or qualification was so far outside their experience that they did not know how to react. Jack looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded, one small dip of his chin, and sat down at his desk. After that, things were different, not easy. Nothing in Bannock was easy, but different. Jack started attending regularly and showed an unexpected aptitude for numbers. He also, Lillian discovered, was carrying a burden that explained a great deal about his anger and his early morning absences and the dark circles under his eyes. She found out by accident, staying late one afternoon to grade papers, when she heard a sound from behind the schoolhouse. A child's voice, singing. She went to investigate and found Jack's 5-year-old sister, Maggie, sitting on a stump behind the building with a piece of bread in her hand and a dress that was 3 sizes too big and had been mended so many times the patches had patches. Jack was raising her, alone. Their father was a drunk who had not come home in weeks, and Jack at 15 had taken on the job of keeping his sister fed and clothed and hidden from the kind of authorities who would take one look at the situation and split them up. A boy taking care of a child who was not technically his responsibility, because someone had to. The parallel was so exact, it made Lillian's throat ache. She did not report them. She knew what the system did to children, and she was not willing to feed 2 more into its machinery. Instead, she began tutoring Jack in the evenings, extra lessons in mathematics and reading that would help him qualify for a blacksmith's apprenticeship in town. And she brought food. Not charity, never charity. Jack would have rejected that with the same fierce pride that Ethan showed when someone tried to help him. Just leftover food from her own kitchen, too much for one woman, a shame to waste it. Maggie started coming to school, sitting in the front row, learning her letters one at a time with the intense concentration of a child who understood in the way children understand things they cannot articulate. That education was a kind of armor. The wanted poster found her in November. Someone passing through town recognized her face from one of the old handbills. The warrant had been withdrawn months ago, part of the legal cleanup following Whitmore's arrest, but the posters had spread across the territory, and not all of them had been collected. The rumor moved through Bannock like wildfire. The new teacher was a kidnapper. The new teacher stole a baby. The new teacher was wanted by the Army. Dorothy Benson called an emergency meeting of the school board. Lillian stood in the back room of Peterson's general store, facing 3 people who held her future in their hands, and told the truth. The whole truth. Philadelphia and Ashford, and the children in the coal mines. The stagecoach and Helen Garrett's dying wish. The ledger and Whitmore and the long road to Helena. She told them everything, every lie she had told and every reason she had told it. And she did not ask for sympathy or understanding or forgiveness. She just laid it out and let them decide. Some parents pulled their children, 3 families, maybe 4, who could not get past the word kidnapper, regardless of context. Lillian understood. She did not blame them. But most stayed. Not because Lillian was blameless, but because she was honest. And in a frontier town where everyone was carrying some kind of past, honesty counted for more than perfection. Dorothy Benson looked at her after the meeting with those sharp, assessing eyes. "You could have lied," she said. "Made up something easier to swallow." "I have told enough lies to last a lifetime," Lillian said. "I am done with them." Ethan came back to Bannock in December. He had been gone 2 months, hired on for a major cattle drive from Texas to Montana. The money was good, better than anything he had earned pushing small herds across the territory, and he needed it badly. The debts from the lost cattle, the expenses of the journey, the cost of starting over from nothing. He had written letters during the drive, short, awkward things that arrived at the Bannock post office smelling of trail dust and containing sentences like "made 18 miles today," "lost 2 head to rattlers," "miss you," "my cooking is terrible without witnesses." He arrived at night, knocked on her cabin door. She opened it and found him standing in the cold, thinner than when he had left, coated in the dust of 1,000 miles of trail. He was carrying the saddle he had taken from Judge, strapped across his back like a cross he was not ready to set down. But his eyes were clear, and when she looked at his hands, they were steady. "I am not going to tell you the nightmares have stopped," he said. "They have not. But I have stopped trying to burn myself over them. I have not had a drink in 2 months. It is the longest I have gone since the war." He paused, looked at her, looked at the cabin behind her, the lamplight, the books on the shelf, the evidence of a life being built. "I want to try something," he said, "not just surviving, building. I do not know if I am any good at it. I have not tried in a long time, but I would like to try. Here, near you." Lillian did not invite him in. She stepped outside, into the cold Montana night, under stars so thick they looked like spilled flour across a dark countertop. She stood beside him. "I am not perfect, Ethan. I lie when I am scared. I try to control everything because I'm afraid of what happens when I cannot. I love a baby who is not mine, and I'm not sure I will ever stop. I'm afraid every single day. Of Ashford finding me. Of this town deciding I am too much trouble. Of you deciding I am not worth the cost." She looked at him. "But I do not want to be afraid alone anymore." He kissed her, kissed. This time it was not clumsy or scared or apologetic. This time they both meant it. And when they pulled apart, standing in the dark with their breath making clouds in the December air, something had settled between them. Not a promise, not a vow. Something quieter and more durable than either. A decision made together to stop running and start staying. Spring came to Montana the way spring always comes there, late and grudging and all the more beautiful for the wait. The snow receded up the mountains and the valley floor turned green and the creek behind the schoolhouse ran high and cold with snowmelt. Lillian stood in front of her class. 23 students now, 6 more than she had started with. Jack Hoskins had graduated and was apprenticed to the town blacksmith, learning a trade that would keep him and Maggie fed and housed without depending on a father who was never coming back. Maggie sat in the front row every day, sounding out words with the fierce concentration that was her brother's legacy and her own inheritance. Emma Peterson, the mercantile owner's bright-eyed daughter, had been accepted to a women's academy in Denver on a scholarship Lillian had helped her apply for. Ethan lived in Bannock, not as a lawman or a hero or anything larger than what he was. A man who worked cattle for the Walsh Ranch and fixed the church roof when storms pulled it loose, and spent his evenings reading on the porch of the cabin next to Lillian's. They were not married. Lillian was not ready for that, and Ethan did not push. But the whole town could see the way they leaned toward each other like trees that have grown in the same wind, and everyone knew it was just a matter of time. His 40 acres were still a dream. He was saving again, but slower now, because he kept spending money on chalk and slates for the school, and he pretended not to know where Maggie Hoskins's new winter coat had come from. On a warm afternoon in May, Lillian dismissed her students and stood alone in the empty classroom. Chalk dust drifted in the slanting light. The pot-bellied stove was cold for the first time since September. Through the window, she could see Ethan on the porch of her cabin, 2 cups of coffee on the rail beside him, both of them growing cold while he waited for her. She stepped to the door and looked out. The Bannock Valley stretched under the afternoon sun, golden grass rippling all the way to the foothills. Beyond them rose the high woods, blue and distant, the mountains where Judge lay buried and where Boone had nearly killed them, and where she had once been certain she was going to die. Now they were just mountains, beautiful and brutal and utterly indifferent to every human story that played out beneath them. Montana did not care whether she lived or died, but she had lived, and that was enough. Somewhere outside, Maggie Hoskins was singing a song Lillian had taught her the day before. The melody was wrong and the words were scrambled, but the voice was loud and unafraid, the voice of a child who had learned that singing was something you did not need permission for. Lillian Moore was not running anymore. She was not lying. She was still afraid. Afraid Ashford would find her. afraid the next winter would be too harsh, afraid this happiness was as fragile as April snow on warm ground. But she had learned something in the years since a dying woman on a Montana roadside had asked her to make a promise, and she had said yes. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing to stay when every instinct told you to run. It was picking up someone else's child and refusing to put her down. It was apologizing when you were wrong and telling the truth when a lie would be easier, and opening your heart when closing it would hurt less. She turned off the lamp, locked the schoolhouse door, and stepped out into the afternoon sun where Ethan was waiting, where the coffee was cooling, where her life was waiting to be lived. This time she made no promises. She just walked forward. And if this story taught you anything, if Lillian's courage and Ethan's choice to keep going when everything was lost meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from. Because some stories are meant to travel far, and this one is not done yet.